The second lecture on Marketing Foundation course of IIEBM. In the previous class, we had discussed in our first lecture what is marketing, and today we will be building up upon that and we will talk about a little historical overview or the evolution of marketing over the years. So, to give a brief recap of what was discussed in the previous class, we basically talked about what marketing is. As an activity, it can be defined as something that is a human activity. It tries to understand human needs and wants, and it focuses on the exchange process. It tries to satisfy those human needs and wants through the exchange process. We put a little bit more focus on what exactly human needs and wants are. So we took the help of certain concepts of organizational behavior or psychology. So we looked at the Maslow's needs hierarchy framework. So there are certain lower order needs or physiological needs, okay, including basic needs such as food, clothing, shelter, then safety needs. Once these needs are satisfied, usually people then look at higher order needs, essentially needs such as belongingness needs or social needs, love, belongingness, etc. Then once these needs are satisfied, then a human being goes to even higher order needs like esteem or self-actualization and so on and so forth. So we had seen that marketers per se are not people who create needs. So needs are inherently given. So they are human beings, their socialization, their upbringing, their early associations in school, in family, in friend circle, etc. It shapes these needs, etc. So the manifestation of these needs is in the form of wants. So everybody feels hungry, but a person basically might feel the need. How he satisfies the need for hunger is in terms of how needs are manifested. So basically, I want X, I want Y, I want a pizza, I want a burger, I want a cold drink. So wants are basically how needs are manifested. So we had distinguished between needs and wants. We had also looked at how demand can be defined. So human needs and wants, when backed by purchasing power, ability to pay, and willingness to buy, these two factors together constitute demand. So a marketer is essentially interested in a group of people existing and potential who constitute demand for a particular product or service, and that is how a business organization basically tries to do its activity. So we also looked at the concept of exchange, which is also a very basic concept. So exchange is where you give something in return for something else from the other person. So there are certain conditions for exchange to take place. There should be certain thing of value that you are looking forward to from the other person, and the other person also should be looking forward to something that he wants to receive from you. So once this give and take happens, then it is called as an exchange. Now exchange can be effected either through barter means, okay, so I exchange a physical good in return for another physical good that I give to the other person, or I give a physical good to somebody and that person gives me money for it. Okay, so money can be a way of effecting certain exchanges. So we had also seen that the basic unit of marketing is nothing but transaction. So transaction is basically the basic unit of marketing. So these are some of the concepts that we had discussed in our previous class. We also looked at in the previous class we also looked at how marketing can be defined using all these concepts put together. So using needs, want, exchange, value, satisfaction, we had tried to effect a definition of marketing. So essentially the purpose of a marketeer is to understand the needs and wants of a customer and try to design a bundle of benefits which we call as a product or a service. Using these bundle of benefits, we try to deliver the product to the customer, and if the customer's expectations are at a particular level and the value that he receives from that particular product or bundle of benefits is more than what he expected, then he is delighted and he possibly keeps coming again. So the relationship develops between the marketer and the customer. And therefore, if relationships develop, transactions keep happening. So the eventual aim of a marketer is to understand the needs and wants of the customer, develop a bundle of benefits that provides value or satisfaction to the customer, deliver this value in an effective manner such that a relationship develops, and for lifetime transactions keep happening between the customer and the service provider. And this is how the concept of marketing can be defined. So this gave us a broad overview about what the activity of marketing is, or what the body of knowledge which we call marketing basically tries to do, and how it is different from other bodies of knowledge. In today's discussion, we are basically trying to look at locating marketing in the context of human civilization and how human civilization has grown over the years, in fact, over centuries. And we would like to understand how, what role does marketing play? Because marketing is a activity that has predated marketing books being written. So marketing was there. The process of exchange, the process of needs and wants has always pre-existed a Kotler writing a book or a Peter Drucker writing about management. So the concepts of marketing have evolved over generations, over years. So our activity in the next uh, 2 hours in this particular discussion is to look at evolution of marketing over the years and how it can be related to the business of human activity, how human beings have conducted themselves over the years, uh, and how marketing has got evolved or has been keeping pace with the human civilization over the years. So it's a very interesting discussion which touches upon anthropology, which touches upon history, which touches upon political economy, which touches upon economics, which touches upon organizational behavior, which touches upon geopolitics. So it's a very interdisciplinary and a very interesting general knowledge related discussion. And we will, at the end of today's discussion, we will be able to locate where marketing fits into this entire game of uh, interdisciplinarity. So let's begin our discussion today with the major stages of societal development. So there are lots of pages have been written, lots of books have been written about how human civilization has developed. In fact, specifically this body of knowledge can be called as anthropology, it can be called as social anthropology, it can be related to paleontology, it can be related to sociology. So management tries to borrow from all these fields and it tries to understand where the specific subject of marketing or the specific subject of human resources or the specific subject of any particular uh, specialization of marketing is located in the overall uh, uh, development or growth of human civilization. Now, obviously, there are various ways of being or the various paradigms of human existence that one can identify. One of the paradigms through which human beings have existed can be called as the pre-agricultural stage, or what can be called as a hunter-gatherer stage. So human beings many years ago, and you will see how many years ago, they existed as hunters or gatherers. So that was one of the ways of being or one of the paradigms of human existence. Once human beings discovered another way of being, they thought that, well, it is a better way of being, and therefore let us continue with the agricultural stage. As compared to the hunter gatherer stage, human beings would have found that it is advantageous to live according to this paradigm. So they subsisted for many years according to what is known as the agricultural stage. And once the agricultural stage resulted in certain inventions, then human beings moved on to another way of being known as the what is known as the industrial stage. Of course, one can also argue that the industrial stage has given way to another stage, which is basically called as the knowledge economy stage. But some people might argue that the knowledge economy stage is something that is a subset of the industrial stage. And so there is a debate about this. We will talk about that in the later part of today's discussion. So essentially, some of the major stages of societal development where human beings have spent hundreds or thousands of years in each of these stages of ways of life is being displayed on this slide. So our intention in today's discussion is to focus on each of these stages and see how human beings basically were living their lives in each of these stages. What were the things that gave them source of livelihood? What were the things that helped them to cope with the forces of nature? What were the things that helped them to uh, coexist with each other? What were the cultural norms that they followed? What were the practices that they followed? How did they look at forces of nature? How did they basically understand the concept of living together, the concept of marriage, the concept of coexistence, the concept of inheritance, the concept of property, the concept of social and political relations? When did they emerge? At which stage did they emerge? And how did modern life as we know it today, how did it evolve? And specifically, how did things like marketing or things like exchange or things like trade and things like specialization, things like delegation, etc., how did they evolve? When did they evolve? So all of these are very essential discussions that help you as a student of marketing, and you should have a very good grip over uh, a general analysis of these paradigms. So essentially, if you look at pre-agriculture stage as first paradigm of being, this as the second paradigm of being, and this as the third paradigm of being. So basically, once human beings evolved from stage 1 to stage 2, one can possibly argue that this was the first wave of human civilization, where one paradigm led to another paradigm or gave way to another paradigm or way of existence. Likewise, from the agriculture stage to the industrial stage, once this jump was made or this leap was made, then one can argue that the human beings was existing according to another paradigm. So it is a second wave of human civilization. And some argue that the industrial stage to the knowledge economy is the third wave of human civilization. So in his book, The Third Wave, author Alvin Toffler, Alvintoffler, Alvin Toffler talks about these three waves of human civilization and how human beings' entire way of life changed from one wave to the other wave, and how the first wave took, if it took X number of years, the second wave took less than X number of years to happen, and how the third wave took even less number of years to happen. So for each successive wave, the time period that it takes to move from one paradigm to the other paradigm, what Toffler talks about as what describes as paradigm shift. So the paradigm shifts have taken fewer number of years to happen from one paradigm to the other paradigm, which essentially tries to say that human civilization has been evolving, has been changing. But people who are living in that particular era may not feel that change. One can have the benefit of hindsight, and one can possibly argue that, well, a person who lived in, let's say, uh, 5,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago in the Indus civilization, and a person who possibly lived in, say, 1200 something or 1300 something during the Mughal era in India would have had a different way of living, social, cultural, economic, and so on and so forth. But when that person is living in 1200 and something or 1300 and something, he's not aware of the kind of paradigms that he's inhabiting. He's going about his own life in a normal way. So one is the individual's own lived reality and various stories that people would have written and recorded or documented about their lives. And one is basically historians when they take an overview of tens of thousands of years and then they basically try to divide or subdivide the various lived reality into, say, 1,000 years. These 1,000 years it was this paradigm, and these next 500 years was a different paradigm, and then the next 200 years has been a different paradigm. So then only with hindsight historians can basically make sense of the lived reality of individuals. So one is the micro or the lived reality of individuals, and the other is the macro uh, from a historian's perspective. So as a student of marketing, one has to understand both the micro or the lived reality of people and how we can locate it in the larger scheme of things. Okay, so that makes you a very good student of general knowledge as well as a student of your subject. So let us focus our attention on the first of these, uh, or basically let's try to take an overview of these two great revolutions in human history. One is of course the agricultural revolution. So basically this is the first wave of human civilization where human beings move from a hunter-gatherer stage to a settled agriculture stage. Now, in the next few slides, we would like to see why human beings was forced to or was okay with moving from one way of life to another way of life. What exactly would have happened? So you can take the help of biology, you can take the help of physical resources, you can take the help of economics. So there are various ways in which you can look at why civilizations have moved from one way of living to another way of living. So we will attempt that in the uh, next few minutes. And of course, the second great revolution in human history has been what is known as the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so what exactly these two revolutions did to people's lives is a very interesting aspect of discussion, which any self-respecting person from any field should know how human civilization has evolved, because we ourselves belong to the human civilization, and many a times history repeats itself. So if one is able to understand historical facts, figures, events, then one is basically blessed enough not to repeat those mistakes. Okay, so it is often said that bad students of history or arrogant people are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history, but wise people basically are always good students of history, and they know how to basically not make the mistakes that their ancestors or their predecessors have made in the past. So that is why we are looking at these issues. In fact, the greatest impact on human ways and states of living have been felt. That is why we are calling them as revolutions. A revolution can't be something that you know uh, affects very minor change in people's lives. It has to be a paradigmatic change. It has to be a tectonic shift in people's lived reality. Only then we would call it as a great revolution. So essentially, it has to have a great impact on human ways and states of living, social, cultural, economic, political, etc. And that is what makes it a great revolution. Some people would also argue that the information and technology revolution, information and communications revolution to be more specific, of the 1980s, both in rest of the world as well as in India, with the advent of the internet and with the advent of communications, uh, which uh, made executives communicate with each other even without being in physical presence of the other person. So, so airline travel was one major revolution, but the other major revolution is that after 1970s and 80s, where internet was available, so people could communicate with each other through video conferencing even without having to visit that particular place. So this, during the COVID lockdown also, most people who are working from home are essentially using the information and communications revolution or the inventions during that time, and they are able to go about their day-to-day lives, which is a big thing. So of course the question is in what ways it is going to transform the ways of living, because we are inhabiting this particular revolution. Okay, right now we are in the midst of this particular way of life. So it's all a question mark as far as how the information and communications revolution is going to influence jobs, it's going to influence people's lived reality, it's going to influence relationships, it's going to affect the entire way of life, okay, or the standard of living of people. So let's start our discussion with a little bit of uh, specific focus on the first way of existence for human beings. So all of us have seen in our school history books something called as hunter gatherer. So you must have seen such photos of, as the visual shows, people with spears, people trying to light a fire, people try to, rub two stones and try to produce fire, and so on and so forth. So these are our ancestors whom we have to be grateful for, because if they were not innovative enough as a species to survive in the wild, we as a species would not have been there today. There are lots of species that have become extinct in the wilderness. So human beings as a species has survived. Okay. Of course, one of the things that the human beings has done is that, of course, human beings is blessed with a higher brain to rest of the body mass ratio. Amongst all living beings, human beings, brain as to rest of the body mass is a very high ratio. But apart from that, apart from the biological uh, advantages that human beings have, how has human civilization evolved? So the first way of being, the first way of lived reality was approximately began about 20,000 years ago. This is called as a hunter-gatherer stage. So how were human beings subsisting during this time? Essentially, the characteristics of life were that they used to have sharp weapons. Using these sharp weapons, they used to hunt animals essentially. And since the number of animals was enough, abundant around them, obviously there was enough food available. Otherwise, as a species or as a group of people, they would not have survived. So there was enough food, and also there would have been sufficient level of physical security, because if you know how to light a fire, if you know how to guard yourself with sharp weapons against predators, so obviously the characteristics of life have been defined as there was enough food and there was sufficient level of physical security to survive and grow. So this is the hunter gatherer stage. The way people subsisted was it was essentially a food economy. So how people subsisted by hunting of animals, as we have just seen, and collecting of wild fruits and vegetables. So they were hunters and gatherers. So they used to hunt animals and they used to gather fruits and vegetables. So obviously this also is a very, very hit and trial method. So in the wild, suppose one day you are tasting some berries and it is a poisonous thing and you die, then all the other people in that particular tribe would see that this particular thing is not edible. So there has to be learning, there has to be recording of the information. And basically, the next time, none of the members of the tribe would be advised to eat that particular berry. Otherwise, you would not survive. So, survival of the fittest, and so many of them would have died in order for us to basically learn and to not make the same mistakes. So actually we owe a lot to the ancestors that have preceded us. So this was what the civilization was. So in a sense, from the lens of today, from today's lens, we can call it as a primitive civilization. But of course, a lot of people, they in today's modern hectic life, you know at the age of 40, 45, when they are feeling mid career stagnation, and they want a lot of money, they want to go back to organic farming. They want to basically do the same hunter gatherer kind of life they want to lead, because digital detoxing unko karna hai. There's too much pressure, there's too much you know worries on the job, too much tension. So a lot of people are wanting to go back to a primitive life, because that was a life which was closer to nature, right? So life is coming full circle, so to speak. So anyway, from today's lens, we would say that अरे ये क्या primitive civilization है. घर आने के बाद ठंड के अंदर हम लोग हीटर ऑन करते हैं, या अगर गर्मी है तो हम लोग एसी ऑन करते हैं. हमारे पास इलेक्ट्रिक फैन है, हमारे पास चाय बनाने के लिए हमारे पास केटल है. तो वो लोग कैसे लिव करते थे? So there are lots of places in the world, even today, in the Amazon forest or in the Bastar in India or in the Andamans, etc. They are still living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In fact, if you look at the Lots of wildlife versus human beings का जो interface, if you see many elephants coming into human settlements, you will find that because of quote unquote development, lots of land has been cleared which used to be earlier the habitat of wild animals, and wild animals have been therefore forced to interact with human beings, and that is where basically the conflict between humans and the and nature comes into play. So the original way of life of tribals, of hunter gatherers is being threatened in many parts of the world because of widespread clearing of forests in the Amazon, or because of the widespread clearing of forests for the IKEA in Romania. In fact, lots of people who are gypsies in Romania, they have who used to live in the forest, their lives are at stake, their livelihood is at stake. So you could call present civilization as quote unquote modern civilization. And from the lens of modernity, you will find that the hunter gatherer stage emerges as or looks like a primitive civilization, quote unquote primitive civilization. Okay, so of course, one man's patriot is another man's terrorist. So, what is primitive to us today was just normal life for them at that particular period of time. Let's look at some more characteristics of the lived reality of hunter gatherer stage. So obviously they were nomads. They did not have one particular place where they were permanently settled. So if today they find that the amount of food that they have, they had earlier is finished and they will have to go in search of food. So they will take their spears and they will take their animal skins and they will take their stones, sharp stones, and they will be looking for animals. So wherever they find the animals, they will kill it and they will try to cook it and they will try to consume that and they will settle for the night there. So it's in a sense a nomadic kind of existence. Of course, there are many parts of the world today where we find like the Bedouins in Africa, the Sahara, and there are many places in India also. There are various nomadic tribes. In fact, nomadic tribes, they don't have a quote unquote permanent address. So during the controversy regarding NRC and CAA, so many of the nomadic tribes were also protesting कि हमारे पास तो permanent address नहीं है, so are we not citizens of this country? And so on and so forth. Anyway, so basically at the hunter-gatherer stage, we found that it was a nomadic life. There was no permanent settlement per se. As far as the culture was concerned, it was essentially a culture which followed tribal norms and traditions. And essentially, even if they, so one doesn't know whether they were worshippers of any gods, but it is understandable to imply that or to infer that since they were dependent on the forces of nature, so if nature was favorable to them, they would get their food. So in Maslow's hierarchy, their needs were which they were looking to fulfill was the lower order needs, that is the physical needs. That is why we call it as a quote unquote primitive civilization. And in order to satisfy those so-called physical needs, they had to depend on the vagaries of nature. So नेचर अगर उनके ऊपर मेहरबान होगा तो फिर उनका वो जिंदा रहेंगे. So one can infer that they were worshippers of pagan. They were pagan worshippers. So pagan worshippers are worshippers of nature. Sun को worship करते हैं, trees को worship करते हैं, certain plants को वो लोग अच्छा मानते हैं, and so on and so forth. So pagan worshippers as compared to organized religion, which will come much later on in the agriculture stage, where there are lots of different types of gods and formal religion has been invented. So here we have very tribal norms and traditions. As far as economic and political life and social life is concerned, it's a simple and informal way. So one can infer that they did not have a very complicated way of conflict resolution where they had a panchayat and they had a court and they had a justice mechanism and they had various elaborate ways, or they had ये मेरा है ये तुम्हारा है property and property disputes and marriage and this is my child and this is not your child and how dare you basically hit my child or how dare you take my cattle. So obviously you don't, as you see in the picture, you don't see any kind of boundary or any kind of land that they have demarcated as their own land. Okay, So obviously the economic arrangement and social organization is simple and informal, which is why we are describing it as a primitive civilization from the point of view of the lens of modernity. Okay. So from the agriculture hunter-gatherer stage, human beings basically starts moving on to what is known as the agricultural stage. So how does this come about? Okay. So about 11,000 years ago, approximately, there was the first paradigm shift from the hunter-gatherer stage to the agricultural stage. So what happens here? Obviously, a major discovery is that I can I need not move from one place to the other. I need not live a nomadic life, because a nomadic life requires me to have brute strength. It requires to have a lot of stamina. It causes a lot of exhaustion. It does not give me any time for relaxation. And there is a lot of uncertainty in terms of availability of food. Okay, so and so on and so forth. On the other hand, once the human beings would have discovered the concept of agriculture. That is, if I plant a seed at a particular place, and in that particular place the crops will grow, or the it will give me fruit, and once that particular fruit is over, again from the seed that falls from that fruit, again I can plant that seed in the same land, and I can keep producing food from a particular piece of land, rather than depending on new areas for my food. So this concept of discovery of the concept of agriculture, that when a seed is planted at a particular place, it gives me fruit from that particular seed, and from that fruit again I can that seed which is produced can give me. So basically the same piece of land will enable me to survive throughout my lifetime without having to move from place to place. So this particular discovery, or this particular invention, or this particular brainwave would have been a major revolution which has affected a different way of life. Of course, in order to subsist using agriculture, you will have to have knowledge of agricultural techniques. Ki, which so fertility of soil, how to basically plant seeds, how much water to give, etc. So many of these settlements would have happened near river systems. Okay, what is known as river valleys. Okay, so many of these river valley systems, or river valley system civilizations, have been seen near the Nile, near the Ganges, near the Euphrates, and so many civilizations around the world, in the Latin America, in America, in Central America, in Africa. So next to the river, you would find a settlement of people who would basically subsist based on agriculture as their main source of livelihood. Now, this is a major shift from nomadic life to settled agriculture. So, as a result of this way of life, human beings for the first time are having to live in close proximity to each other. So, if I am subsisting using this particular model, that is agriculture, my neighbor is also subsisting using this particular model. So, I have a piece of land which I call it as quote unquote mine. Ye mera hai. He has a piece of land that he calls as ye mera hai. So this mera tumhara basically gives rise to a concept known as ownership, a concept which we today know as property. The entire legal system as we know it has come about only because of the concept of property. In the hunter gatherer stage, there is no land which is yours and there is no land which is his. So my land and his land, what we know as political life. Political comes from the word polis, which means people. So people have to now, for the first time in human civilization, have to exist with each other. That means the word social, society के साथ जीना है. So the entire concept of social life, the entire concept of political life, and the entire concept of social and political organization, whether we have a village, whether we have a village headman, whether we have a group of people who settle disputes amongst the villagers, whether we have a property dispute that his livestock has entered my farm and it has destroyed the property. So what punishment should he be given, and how much of the punishment should be in kind, how much of the punishment should be in terms of cash, etc., etc. So all of these concepts, settlement of disputes, property, the concept of marriage, because now your property after your death will go to somebody, so it has to go to somebody that you think is yours. So the concept of marriage, the concept of reproductory rights, the concept of livestock, all of these concepts. So agriculture also, agriculture and so settled agriculture along with living with livestock gives rise to an entire way of living uh, that includes a kind of political organization that is completely different from the ones that we had in the tribal one. There it was very informal, but you can't have conflict disputes, resolution of conflicts that are informal. So today, for a similar kind of conflict, I give this kind of verdict, but after 5 months, if a similar kind of conflict happens, I can't give a different kind of verdict. So that would amount to bias. So there has to be a social contract. There has to be a set of rules by which everybody decides that we will agree to be governed by. So the concept of social contract comes in, the concept of ruler comes in, the concept of agreeing that this particular person will be my ruler and I will accept whatever this particular says is right is right. Okay, of course how much say I will have in that or not, that is a different issue. So the concept of state, the concept of ruler, that is emperor, all of these concepts come into play. So also the living conditions become steady, because now you are not moving from place to place, and you are therefore going to spend your entire life in a particular place. So if a person is born in a particular city or in a particular village, he or she would possibly die in that particular village. Okay, unlike in the hunter gatherer times where you are moving from place to place. So there is a lot of change in culture, social and economic structures that we find as compared to the previous paradigm. And these changes basically are very important for us to understand, because there are lots of societies today, there are lots of societies in existence today which are living based on a settled agriculture, which are living in a feudal system, so to speak. So what are the changes that were encountered during this stage? So if you see the Roman Empire, the Greek and Roman emperors, okay, so whether you see Julius Caesar, whether you see Commodus, whether you see Marcus Aurelius, all of these emperors ke time pe, if you see their stories, so it was during the agriculture stage. In fact, Europeans, they used to get their wheat etc from Egypt, so there was trade also involved. So we will see what are the interesting things that developed. Unlike in the earlier stage where reading and writing was not there, in this particular stage, reading and writing basically came into play. So you see in this particular slide, somebody is writing on a clay tablet. So the concept of writing, the concept of making certain markings and somebody else being able to write it. So that means record keeping is happening. So basically, future generations will learn from what the previous generations basically they acquired knowledge. Then organized religions, as you can see in this particular slide, various organized religions came into play. So a particular way of being is considered to be a right way of being, and a particular way of being is considered not right. So the Bible will tell you that to steal or to take something that does not belong to you is not right. Now, this is a part of organized religion. If you have a need that you are hungry, and if somebody has some food, you just take it. But to take something that does not belong to you is bad. That is again a part of quote unquote a civilized way of being or a new social contract. So there are different ways of what is good, what is bad. Certain people basically, when you are in trouble, they would try to give you some kind of guidance. So they would be called as priests, or they would be called as teachers, or they would be called as knowledgeable people, or they would be called as leaders, they would be called as statesmen. So again, class is developing in society. Certain people of higher class, erudite people, or so reading and writing gives rise to concept of knowledge. So certain people who are holders of knowledge, they might have the currency of power. So please note, while the currency of power in the pre-agriculture stage was with people who had brute strength, here the currency of power is shifting to people who had a knowledge of agriculture, ownership of land, as well as knowledge of reading, writing, etc. Or better at handling disputes, or better at communicating with the other people, or having good social relations with the other people. So a lot of soft skills that we call today are evolving as a necessary tool for human survival. So this is a very interesting way of being. Emergence of states and empires. So the Holy Roman Empire, you know, so typically these are some of the famous empires in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Other important changes that are pertinent to our discussion for marketing are expansion of trade. We will talk about trade and commerce, and we will use trade and commerce to get into the discussion into marketing very soon. So this was a very important thing. Now the concept of trade. In the last lecture, we have discussed the concept of exchange. So the concept of exchange would have come about in the agricultural stage, where a farmer is producing something and the potter is producing something, and the surplus that the farmer generates and the surplus that the potter generates is is good enough for people, for his own needs and for other people's needs. So basically, if I exchange what I make with another person who is not making that thing, then I basically result in what is known as effect trade. So the concept of trade has expanded because of generation of surplus, and we will talk more about this. And so basically, once trade comes into play, the concept of merchant life, even if I am not doing farming, I am not doing hunting, I am not doing tailoring, I can basically set up a market in the middle of the village, and I can buy the surplus from the farmer, the surplus from the potter, and the surplus from the tailor. And then whenever the tailor wants grains, I can basically exchange the grains that I have bought from the farmer with the tailor, and the excess cloth that the tailor basically sells me, I can sell it to the hunter or I can sell it to the farmer. So this kind of way of life gives rise to a new profession known as merchant, or a trader, or a middleman, or a person who only buys and sells, and that is how he basically makes his livelihood. So essentially, a person, let's say a banker is taking money from a person who has surplus and is giving money to a person who does not have money to run his business, and in between he is basically making a profit. So he's accepting deposits at, let's say, 8% per annum, and he is giving loans at, let's say, 10% per annum. So between 10 and 8%, whatever is the margin, that is the banker's profit. So essentially, this concept, so if you look at Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, Shylock was the merchant out there. So the concept of merchant, and if a person is in trouble, if a person is not able to pay his debts, then the merchant charges a very high rate of interest. So merchant becomes a very powerful entity in the social setup during the agricultural stage. Then again, tradable products became a growing economic activity. So trading products, trade as an activity became very important. Services also began to expand. So services का भी trade हो रहा है, right? So it is not just goods but also services. So these are some of the innovations that were characteristic of the agricultural stage. Of course, this agricultural stage, or what is known as the feudal stage, has existed for thousands of years in human civilization. So we have the concept of trade and commerce. So it would be instructive at this particular stage to draw our attention to what is known as trade and commerce. What exactly is trade and what exactly is commerce? We have just seen in the earlier discussion the concept of exchange and the concept of transaction. So if your want is backed by your ability to pay. That means you constitute demand for that particular thing. So there is a concept known as comparative advantage that you will be studying in your economics or in your trade theories. Ricardo's concept of comparative advantage. So exactly what is the reason for trade? Why trade happens? And essentially the discussion on marketing will have to be located in the broader discussion of what is trade and why trade happens. In fact, a country or a person is said to have comparative advantage if they have the ability to produce something at a lower opportunity cost than their trade partners. Lower opportunity cost than their trade partners. So essentially, it brings to focus what is the concept of economic cost or opportunity cost. So though it is a concept of economics, but since marketing is an interdisciplinary field, we will try to understand that in simple language. So what is this opportunity cost? It can also be known as foregone opportunity. So what is this foregone opportunity? When you allocate scarce resources to some task, you allocate scarce resources to some task, you are giving up alternate uses for those resources. So you could have become an engineer, but you have chosen not to become an engineer and you have chosen to join the commerce stream. So your entire engineering fees you would have had to spend, you would have got a job, and whatever salary that you would have earned from the job of engineering, you are basically foregoing. And so basically today you have chosen to get into commerce. So what is the foregone opportunity of whatever you would have got had you done engineering? But the fact that you have chosen to do commerce, you would never know actually in quantifiable terms what exactly, because you've never gone down that path. But at the same time, there is a there is an element of missed opportunity or a foregone opportunity. So when you allocate some resources which are always scarce resources to a particular task, you give up alternative uses of those resources. आप आपके 2 या 3 या 4 साल में क्या क्या और कर सकते थे. सो इंजीनियरिंग करते समय आप और क्या कर सकते थे वो नहीं कर पा रहे. या सपोज लुक एट द अदर वे अराउंड, लॉट ऑफ पीपल हु आर डूइंग इंजीनियरिंग, they feel that had I done commerce, I would have been able to take part in extracurriculars because my engineering syllabus does not allow me to have too much spare time, and that using that time I would have become a good singer, or I would have been a good guitar player, or I would have basically participated in the sports activities, or I would have gotten into dramatics club. So these are all the foregone opportunities of had you done a commerce course and you would have had more spare time. तो आपको लगता है the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. So but when you are doing engineering, thinking about all those foregone opportunities does not really help you to cope with life. Okay, anyway, so as a business reality, you will always have certain cost of physical inputs and certain cost of foregone opportunities that would basically mean the opportunity cost. So essentially, as we have seen on the definition on the slide, the value of everything that you need to give up to produce that good is known as the economic cost or the opportunity cost of something. So let's say there is a commercial pilot and there is a baker. Let's use this example. Now the commercial pilot can do very good baking. बहुत बढ़िया केक बनाता है वो जो केक वो जो बनाता है, जो बेकर के जो दुकान में है, वो बेकर खुद ऐसा केक कभी नहीं बना पाता है जितना अच्छा केक कमर्शियल पायलट बनाता है. So essentially, what do we have reality? The commercial pilot can bake and cook better than the baker can bake or cook. That is the reality. So the commercial pilot has an absolute advantage in baking and cooking over the baker. Yet the commercial pilot keeps doing piloting or flying, and the baker keeps doing baking. Why? The baker probably has a comparative advantage in baking because the opportunity cost of baking is very high for the pilot. If the pilot leaves his piloting job and does baking, possibly the kind of earnings that he is going to forego as a result of adopting the field of baking as a profession might be too restrictive or too high for him to adopt a alternate profession. So the commercial pilot keeps on doing piloting activity and the baker keeps on doing baking activity. So essentially why this is happening? Because essentially the baker has a comparative advantage in baking because the opportunity cost of baking is too high for a pilot, right? So this is at the individual level. Similarly, a person or a country also has a comparative advantage in the production of a particular commodity. Let's say the US has a comparative advantage in producing soya bean and also a comparative advantage in producing aircrafts over many other countries because the technology of aircrafts was discovered first in the US. The soil and the kind of farm holdings in the US are very ideal for soybean farming, etc. China, on the other hand, might have a comparative advantage in producing clothing or footwear in its SEZ factories. Also, China would have a comparative advantage in producing computer parts and phones as compared to, let's say, another country like US. So what is going to happen is that because China has a comparative advantage in footwear and clothes, China keeps producing footwear and clothes in huge quantities, and US does not waste its resources in producing footwear and clothes because had it done so, it would have not been able to compete with China in producing clothes and footwear. So the US puts all its labor resources and its monetary resources in producing soya bean, aircraft, etc. And China also requires a lot of soya bean because in Chinese food, soya sauce, etc. is an essential commodity. So China keeps importing soya bean from the US, aircrafts also from the US, Boeing, etc. And US on the other hand keeps importing clothes, footwear, computer parts, uh, uh, phones, etc. So this is called as the rationale or the reason as to why trade happens between these two countries. Of course, if you look at the 2019, early 2019, there was a trade or a tariff war between the US and China. So if you look at uh, normal trade, or if you look at the terms of trade, US and China should be continuing to do trade. But because of political reasons, the countries have basically imposed certain sanctions on each other, and therefore it has disrupted the global supply chains in all parts of the world. And therefore, it is a less efficient way of doing things because of the tariff war between the two countries. However, if market forces were to allowed to be operating, so you would find that the comparative advantage justifies the action of having trade between these two countries. So this is essentially what the concept of trade is, right? So further, let's look at evolution of trade and commerce over the years. So if you are a student of good student of history, you would know that there are various phases of Western civilization. One of the phases is called as the Greek Roman era or the golden age of philosophy. So before Christ, Greek and Roman age, the age of scientific thought, rational thought, etc. The city states, okay, rule of law, and all of that. The Middle Ages, from more or less 0 AD till let's say 14th, 15th, 16th century, you have what is known as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. And the third stage is called as the Renaissance. stage, or reawakening or rediscovery of the Greek and Roman age, which happens from after the Industrial Revolution, 17th, 18th century onwards. So more or less, if you look at the evolution of trade and commerce, evolution of trade and commerce basically is going to coincide with the movement of human beings from the hunter-gatherer stage to the agriculture stage. So once you have civilizations like the Mesopotamian civilization, the uh, 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 Roman civilization, the Greek civilization, etc. So all these civilizations in Europe, they found that certain goods were not present in Europe, say spices, silk, and several other commodities were rare in Europe. So you must have heard about concepts like Silk Route. So the route which was basically used by traders to travel from Europe to China. So that is called as the Silk Route. So throughout Eurasia into China and entering into Europe. So China, in fact, currently is trying to build a BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and they are trying to resurrect the old Silk Route and trying to make China a dominant player in trade and commerce in the world. Okay, so anyway, so essentially there is something called as a commercial revolution that has happened. That is trade and commerce का जो revolution है, बहुत बड़ी तादाद में इंटर कंट्री ट्रेड और इंटर रीजन ट्रेड बढ़ गया. So between 11th century, that is the in the Middle Ages, to the mid 18th century, we have witnessed, the world has witnessed what is known as a commercial revolution. That means whatever surplus a particular region generates, it is traded with another region because there is comparative advantage in doing trade with the other region. So this is facts. These are actually events that have happened in history. In fact, specifically, if you look at between 1096 and 1271, there were we have seen earlier that the settled agriculture phase has also basically given rise to the growth of empires and the growth of religions, organized religions. So the religion of Christianity was on the upsurge in Europe during this particular phase, and the emperors or the rulers of those provinces were collaborating with the church in order to make people adhere to a certain set of rules or a certain set of doctrines that were supposed to be followed by everybody. So people who were believers in pagan religions, that is people who used to worship sun or trees or etc., they were considered what is known as heretics, Heretics. Heretics are those who are non-believers. So अगर आप ऑर्गेनाइज क्रिश्चियनिटी के अंदर अगर आप बिलीव नहीं करते हैं तो आपको चर्च प्रोसिक्यूट करेगा. So there were knights, KNIGHTS, who basically used to go on horseback with their spears, and they used to hunt these people who were quote unquote pagans, and they used to prosecute them. They used to be hanged also from castles and all. So throughout this time, 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, these 150 200 years was a phase where these non-believers were hunted, and they were so these are called as the holy wars, also called as the holy wars. A lot of persecution, a lot of ugly phase in human history. During this particular phase, on horseback, people used to take their caravans and go from one place to the other. So the Silk Route, for example, the Europeans rediscovered spices, silk, and other commodities which basically were rare in Europe, and so on. So Asia and Europe के बीच में land का जो trade है वो शुरू हुआ. In fact, the phase of mercantilism, if you look at the 15th, 16th, 17th century onwards, you had what is known as colonialism or imperialism. So where the emperor, say Victoria, or the Spanish ruler or the Portuguese ruler, they would send expeditions to the rest of the world to search for new markets. because the surplus that they are generating using the industrial revolution. So now with the invention of the steam engine, with the invention of the IC engine, with the invention of the steam engine, what you have is you are able to generate goods that are far more than what you yourself require. So meeting the needs of Spain, meeting the needs of Portugal, meeting the needs of Britain, there is still surplus available that can be traded with other countries in the world. So obviously this particular quote unquote civilized world tries to look for new colonies or new markets. So this hunt for new markets made some of the emperors, some of the rulers in Europe send expeditions. In fact, the expedition of Vasco da Gama to India in 1498 when he reached Cochin is also part of these expeditions that the Portuguese rulers used to send. So trade with the Arabs, trade with the Europeans, there's a lot of history of India having traded with Europe and Arab countries throughout the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century. In fact, Europeans के साथ ट्रेड जो शुरू हुआ 17th century, 18th century, and a good part of the 19th century was essentially the era of what is known as colonialism or the era of imperialism. इंपीरियलिज्म को हिंदी में हम लोग बोलते हैं साम्राज्यवाद. एम्पायर से आता है इंपीरियलिज्म. So what exactly happened during this particular period? So once you have found a new colony, say the East India Company came to India and they sought permission for trading from the then Emperor Jahangir in the early 1600s. So essentially, once they got permission to trade, so they were taking their goods to the seafront, and from there their vessels used to take it back to Britain, and then from Britain they would get certain goods back to India for selling. So obviously this particular thing enabled their factories back home to develop their economic development, more sources of employment, their economy doing well. However, if you take the raw material from the colonies and you do not really develop the industrial infrastructure of the colonies, then it is also always a one-way trade. So trade is not happening because the two parties have basically agreed to trade on these commodities because of comparative advantage reasons. It is happening based on what you basically perceive as your interests. So essentially, over the period of time, once these European powers, they also got a sphere of influence or a control over some of these colonies in terms of political control also. They had a sitting army to guard their goods, and then they started conniving with some of the rulers in order to give them protection, and therefore they also had political ambitions. So economic and political powers they became in some of these colonies. So Britain, for example, had the sphere of influence over much of India and many parts of Asia and many parts of Africa as well. Spain had a sphere of influence in many parts of Latin America, many parts of America, and so on. So obviously, this era saw a lot of trade, but this trade was almost one-way trade. It was not necessarily benefiting the colonies. It was benefiting possibly only the colonial masters. So Dadabhai Naoroji in his treatise has described this as a drain of wealth. So it was one-way trade happening from the colonies to the colonial masters. So unlimited riches were accumulated. So if you see in this particular slide, this particular caption, so you have Queen Victoria basically getting all the goodies, getting all the riches from the colonies, and everything is being served to her on a platter. In fact, if you look at modern day Britain, and if you look at the supermarkets of Britain, if you go to a Tesco or if you go to a Sainsbury in Britain, you will find most of the food items that you find on the in the supermarkets, you will find the labels sourced from Australia, sourced from New Zealand, sourced from Brazil. They don't grow their own tea. Though British are the famous tea drinkers in the world, they don't drink their tea. They don't make their own coffee. They don't make their own meats. So many of these things are imported. So essentially, the history of trade has been a very long-standing one, and this mercantilism has basically been the mainstay of global trade for almost 3 or 4 centuries. So almost 1700 to a good part of the 1800s and into well into the 1900s also. So almost 300 years, 1700s, 1800s, and some part of 1900s. So almost 200, 210, 220 years we have mercantilism and this kind of trade prevailing. Post Second World War, you have what is known as the Cold War era, and this is another phase in trade and commerce, right? So let's now focus our attention on evolution of trade and commerce over the years. Okay. In fact, people often talk about globalization in the context of trade, in the context of WTO, World Trade Organization. People do talk about globalization, people do talk about multinational corporations, people talk about transnational corporations, people talk about most favored nation status should be given to every country, no country should erect tariff barriers with each other, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, the crux of marketing, in fact, post Second World War, the entire landscape, the entire ecosystem of trade and commerce has come to be dominated by a few transnational, I'm sorry, a few transnational corporations or a few multinational corporations. In fact, some of these multinational corporations, the kind of market capitalization that they have, the kind of uh, wealth that they have in terms of their listed wealth in the stock markets is far, far higher than many countries' entire GDP, gross domestic product. So obviously, certain countries in the world wield unlimited power, or the power is skewed in favor of certain multinational corporations as compared to even countries. So the kind of leverage that some of the multinational corporations have over countries is quite phenomenal. In fact, they can influence regimes in that country. They can change regimes that are not favorable to them, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, if you recall Lord Wellesley's, there was this various policies that you had, subsidiary alliance policy, and the British had many other policies in which they used to uh, decree that if a princely state in India did not have a legal heir or a legal offspring, then the kingdom would not basically be legally given to an adopted child, and the British would take it over. So obviously here the East India Company is trying to have political ambitions. So similarly, many of the multinational or the transnational corporations, because of the enormous wealth, money power that they have, and money as a this thing also gives them a lot of political leverage. They are able to influence policies. They are able to influence decisions of governments the world over. So this has been a very interesting development over the last few decades. So how this has come about? So we would like to understand certain aspects of globalization, because in today's world you have to locate yourself in the macroeconomic scenario that is prevailing in today's world. You can't say that I will not read about globalization, I will not read about WTO, I have no knowledge about general knowledge, and therefore I will become a good marketing professional or I will become a good management professional. A management professional essentially has to be a generalist, and therefore having a grip over the kind of economic winds of change that has happened over the last 300, 400 years and how we find ourselves today is extremely critical. So the discussion that we are now going to proceed with is evolution of trade and commerce over the years in general, and how do we locate the evolution of marketing and how it has kept pace with the evolution of trade and commerce. In fact, If you do a detailed study of globalization and its history, of course, globalization, people say that the world is a global village. It's a very oft repeated cliche. ग्लोबल विलेज, पूरा दुनिया ग्लोबल विलेज हो चुका है. आप आज के डेट में आप मेलबर्न में ब्रेकफास्ट कर सकते हैं और बॉम्बे में आप दोबारा ब्रेकफास्ट कर सकते हैं. ओके, दुबई में जाके आप लंच कर सकते हैं और लंदन में जाके आप दुबई दोबारा लंच कर सकते हैं, 2 बार लंच कर सकते हैं और फिर आप न्यूयॉर्क में जाके आप डिनर कर सकते हैं. सो बेसिकली दुनिया एक ग्लोबल विलेज बन चुका है. So McDonald बोलता है कि think global, act local. So it comes up with a burger in India which has potato in it, aloo burger, and it tries to have a kind of uh, service or service quality that is applicable both in New York as well as in Bombay. So what's happening out here is that the world is quote unquote becoming a global village. This has become a cliche. So globalization essentially क्यों होता है? So suppose people were given the free will to decide whether to trade with one country or to not trade with the other country. Would they basically indulge in trade or would they choose to produce everything on their own? So would they continue to have self-sufficiency? So India produces bananas, India produces cars, India produces aircrafts, India produces automobiles, everything India does. But if suppose Boeing is able to produce aircrafts or Airbus is able to produce aircrafts better than India does, and India is able to produce bananas or India is able to produce iron and steel better than possibly some other country does, Netherlands does. So why don't we basically take certain technological items from Netherlands or from America and give certain other commodities to those countries? So globalization, in fact, the extent of globalization is measured by something known as a trade openness index. Okay, so it might appear a little technical for you, but we will try to convert that into a simple manner. So essentially, trade openness index is a kind of ratio. In the numerator, you have sum of world exports and imports. मतलब दुनिया में जितना भी ट्रेड हो रहा है उसको आप न्यूमरेटर में डालते हैं. The sum of all the जितना भी डॉलर का ट्रेड हो रहा है you put it in the numerator. And denominator you put world GDP. So the ratio of the sum of the world exports and imports, that is the total trade in the world का जो amount है, and denominator में the world GDP. This is called as a trade openness index. Now if you look at, so it is an indicator of to what extent trade influences domestic economic activities. So if the trade openness index is say 20%, 30% or 40%, it is very high. That means your domestic economic activities is highly influenced by trade. Say a country like Japan or a country like Korea are essentially export oriented countries, right? So their participation in world trade is very high as compared to their GDP, right? So for a particular country also you can calculate what is the total of your exports and imports as compared to your GDP. This particular ratio would also show how much dependent on world trade or trade between country to country is your domestic economy dependent on, right? Now why are we using this? So basically tracking trade openness index over a period of time helps us to see to what extent trade or globalization has been happening in the world. So if the trade openness index is say 0.5% or 1% or 2% or 5%, it's very low. In fact, during 1500 to 1800, when the trade in the world was essentially driven by colonialism, which was one-way trade, it was characterized by very low trade openness index. It was characterized by very low trade openness index. What does it basically mean? It means that most of the trade that used to happen it was one-way trade. It did not benefit other countries. So essentially, it was intra-European trade, essentially, or within the country trade. In the truest sense of the term globalization, if you have to talk about the various waves of globalization, one of the waves of globalization, first wave of globalization came from 1800 to 1900. Between this particular period, it was essentially driven by intra-European trade. Say Netherlands is trading with Spanish, the Spanish are trading with the Germans are trading with the British are trading with the Spanish, and so on and so forth. So intra-European trade हो रहा है ज़्यादा. कॉलोनीज से सब आप माल लेके आ रहे हैं, slaves को भी लेके आ रहे हैं, as we have seen in an earlier slide. In fact, the entire mercantilism phase as well as in the post-industrial revolution phase, you have a lot of manual labor taken from Africa, which is put into the plantations and they are put in chains and they are forced to do manual labor, and therefore it's a exploitation of human labor, which is also happening till date also in many parts of the world. So you find the trade openness index remains very moderate. So what does it mean? In the first wave of globalization between 1800 and 1900, which was primarily driven by intra-European trade, it was not truly globalization in the uh, strictest sense of the term. Now, two very crucial events happen in early part of the 20th century. Of course, 1914 to 1919, you have the First World War, and 1939 to 1945, you have the Second World War. In fact, during the World Wars, the entire effort of all countries is going into financing war. Certain countries which are financing both the parties, the Axis powers as well as the allies, like USA, their economies flourish because oil was discovered first in the United States, and the entire aviation technology, the entire tanks, ammunition, etc., was supplied by the US. So the US defense industry has received a huge impetus after the First World War, and the 1920s also saw a lot of boom in the US, riding on the First World War uh, uh, flourishing economy. After the 1930s, there was a recession in Europe, and again during the Second World War, again there was a slump. So during the First World War and the Second World War, the trade openness index was close to negligible, very low. Post Second World War, that is 1945 onwards, you can describe this as the second wave of globalization. It could be described as a kind of trade between countries which is driven by market forces. Of course, dominated by the US, which basically uh, set up what is known as the IMF and the World Bank to rebuild economies that were destroyed by the war, and also won a lot of construction contracts in the war ravaged states. And so post Second World War, you found the triumph of capitalism. So 1950s and 1960s is known as the baby boomer phase in America. We will talk about that, and we will see how marketing as an activity changed from the pre-war era. So our focus in the next few slides will be to look at how marketing changed from this era to post 1945, and what are the philosophies, what are the attitudes, what are the driving ideology that drove marketing from that era to this era. A question that arises in our minds is that, well, till date we find that, well, of course we are under the WTO regime where every country has to treat the other country as a most favored nation status. They cannot erect any non-tariff barriers, and so on and so on. Having said that, COVID-19 has been an event that people have not seen since 1918, when there was a Spanish flu pandemic. So after 100 years, the world has seen a major tectonic shift or a major change in paradigm. Now, where it is estimated that crores of people in big economies like India or USA are estimated to have lost their jobs. How is it going to affect the existing economic infrastructure? And how is it going to affect the entire world of trade, the entire world of what professions are going to last, what professions will basically change over, what is going to be the size of the world GDP, what is going to be the size of exports and imports in the post-COVID era, how will the stock market prices of these major transnational corporations be affected? As a result of that, how will individual salaries be affected? As a result of individual salaries being affected, how is it going to affect your own consumption habits? How is it going to affect your saving habits? How is it going to affect your entire lives? So the entire world of marketing, the entire world of domestic economies is now completely, uh, up for the asking. So a lot of people are predicting that post COVID, could there be a tectonic shift, or could there be a change? Since we are currently passing through this particular phase, we might not be able to know कि क्या हो रहा है. It's almost like being inside a submarine. You don't know how it looks from up, or you're traveling inside a railway bullet train. So you don't know how it looks from outside. So when you come outside, you might find yourself 25,000 kilometers away from where you were, or you might find yourself in the same place that you were. So it is the current post-COVID scenario might also see a lot of evolution of trade and commerce, and we have to wait and watch as far as how the field of marketing or the field of commerce is going to evolve over the ages as a result of this event. Now, as far as current books of marketing are concerned that we read, whether it is Philip Kotler or others, we see that it is a systematic body of knowledge which has been developed during the second wave of globalization, that is post Second World War. So most of the books that we see are basically assuming that the market is a buyer's market. So what is a buyer's market? A buyer's market is a market in which the buyers have the final say in the market. That means the buyers can dominate in the market. The seller does not dominate. So the supply and demand forces are such that the supply of goods is limited and the demand is more. Then it becomes a seller's market. But if the supply is more and the demand is less, then the customer can demand, or the customer can basically dominate, and he can say that why should I buy your product? I will buy somebody else's product. So basically, post Second World War saw a plethora of, or a mushrooming of a lot of companies, and they then had to understand the needs and wants of the market and then had to produce a product accordingly. Pre Second World War, you found that it was more of a seller's market. So if I am producing something, I might be the monopoly producer, and then everybody basically had to buy my products, whether it was of good quality or not. So you'll find that in India also it has, in the 1960s and 1970s India, you find that there was a lot of uh, closed economy and sellers market situation prevailed. But post 1990-91, after LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization, we've seen a scenario of a buyer's market prevailing. Suddenly, there was a lot of competition. So the Maruti had to face a competition from General Motors and Ford Motors and Hyundai and others. Insurance company like LIC had to face competition from other players like Prudential or Max or many others, or Alliance, etc. So in that scenario, marketing will completely change. So the marketer will have to take the efforts to convince the buyer as to why he should buy the marketer's product. In a seller's market scenario, the buyer has no choice but to buy that particular product. So therefore, when we look at evolution of marketing over the years, we will have to relate that to the macroeconomic scenario and how trade and commerce have evolved over the years. So that is why we have engaged in this particular discussion. In fact, in the second wave of globalization, we find that the trade openness index has been as high as 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, even 60%. So the era post Second World War, 1950s onwards, has been the era of globalization. Okay, of course, in India it has arrived 20-30 years late in the 1990s, and currently also we find that India is considered as a country that is connected to the rest of the world. So what happens in the Arab countries, what happens in the United States does affect the stock markets in India. It is no longer a closed economy that हमको फर्क नहीं पड़ता है कि दुनिया में क्या हो रहा है या नहीं हो रहा है. So with this overview or with this background about the trends in the global scenario, let's look at how marketing has been therefore coping with the changes over the years. So we basically talk about something called as marketing concepts. How marketing concepts are often known as marketing philosophies. If you recall, in the first lecture, we discussed that marketing can be considered as a process, it can be considered as a body of knowledge, it can also be considered as a philosophy, right? So, marketing as a philosophy has been undergoing changes over a period of time, right? So, what is a philosophy? A philosophy is a way of belief, is an attitude. So, what should be the guiding philosophy for doing marketing? Five philosophies have been identified. One is basically the production concept. Then we have the product concept. Then we have the selling concept, is often called as a sales concept also. The fourth is the marketing concept. And we also have what is known as the social marketing concept. So we will basically talk about each one of them and we will see how the second concept is different from the first concept, how the third concept is different from the second concept, and so on and so forth, right? So essentially, these are philosophies. These are approaches towards business, approaches towards customer, approaches towards the market. So my practice of marketing would depend on the attitude or the philosophy I have about the market. So the first concept that we can analyze is known as the production concept. So let's have a look at this slide. The philosophy that guides this particular concept or this particular way of looking at marketing is that consumers, so there is a belief or there is a presupposition that consumers will favor those products that are available and that are low in cost. So जो product सबसे सस्ता है और जो available है. So suppose I am producing a washing powder. In fact, in 1980s, there is a very famous marketing case study, Nirma versus Hindustan Lever Limited. Hindustan Lever Limited was the pioneer in washing powders and detergents in the 1980s through its Surf brand, which was a flagship brand of the product. Karsanbhai Patel of Nirma came up with television ads, and television was a very new concept in India at that time. He came up with television ads which basically said that वही धुलाई आपको मिलेगी कम दाम में, वही धुलाई आपको मिलेगी कम दाम में. And this particular message caught the imagination of the public in India. Okay, Sasta Sundar Tikau, that particular appeal is always a universal appeal for people in India. And Surf tried a lot of things, including sales promotion, giving a bucket along with a 5 kg pack, etc. But nothing worked. The consumers were quite impressed by Nirma. So basically, the philosophy that was adopted out there was that make the product available, सारे जगह पे available कर दो, and make it low in cost. In fact, another innovation was something called as T series, Gulshan Kumar. he did it with music cassettes. So where truck drivers and basically they would like to listen to songs, but they could not afford a HMV. HMV was a leading brand at that time. So their cassettes might cost 80 rupees, 90 rupees per cassette. But if you want to listen to a Mohammad Rafi song or a Kishore Kumar song or a playback song of Asha Bhosle, etc., then they would T series would basically produce it in low cost by giving chance to young singers like Sonu Nigam and others, and then get it recorded in a beautiful voice, which sounds like Mohammad Rafi's voice, but it's not Mohammad Rafi's voice because Mohammad Rafi is long gone and dead. But people would like to listen to Mohammad Rafi. So you make it available and you make it available to various places on the highway like pawn shops, etc. And the truck drivers would purchase it from there at 20 rupees, 30 rupees, and lo and behold, you have a new market. So in fact, that was considered as a marketing genius. So essentially, this particular philosophy is driven by the belief that consumers will favor products that are available and they are low in cost. So essentially, production efficiencies, high product actually production efficiency and wide distribution coverage is basically the name of the game. So typically in process oriented industries where let's say you are producing polymers, so for 24 hours your factory is running. So basically if you are able to get a world class plant and you are able to produce say one bag of high density polyethylene at let's say 20 rupees lesser than another player who's able to produce that one bag at say 80 rupees and you are able to produce it at 60 rupees. So you will completely dominate that market because there the brand does not matter. So X brand or Y brand of high density polyethylene would not matter because high density polyethylene would possibly be used as a raw material for some of the upstream industries. So essentially, for certain industries, this particular thing to keep your production efficiencies, to keep your assembly line production cost in check, etc., might be the priority. So this was so essentially when demand is more than supply, that means it is a it is a seller's market. Suppliers concentrate on finding ways to increase production. Okay, आपका बहुत orders पड़ा हुआ है और basically आपको production efficiencies को focus करना है. So here the philosophy is quality products at affordable prices. Objective is to minimize your costs and try to keep quality high and by focusing on production and distribution efficiency. So essentially this is what the production concept is all about. The production concept, as we have tried to discuss earlier, is prevalent when it's a seller's market. And it basically began during the rise of the industrial age. And the famous example is the Model T. Model T was a particular model of car which Henry Ford was very proud of, and it used to be produced only in one color. Because if you have too many colors, then the production efficiencies will not be available and then the cost of the production will increase. So the famous statement that Henry Ford used to say was, take any car as long as it is black. Take any car as long as it is black. That means I will produce a car which is of very good quality, but I will not be able to give you multiple variants. But of course, I will give it to you at a very low cost and which is more affordable than anybody else in the market can give you. So that is a claim that was made, very confident claim. So whenever we discuss production concept, the name of Model T of Ford Motors comes to mind. Okay, so it is a function of your market being a seller's market. It is dependent on your market being a seller's market. Then this particular concept will be useful or applicable. Okay, so where you want to have economies of scale. Then of course, another approach towards marketing is to basically be guided by the belief that consumers will favor those products that offer the best quality, best performance, or innovative features. So here it's almost an inventor's kind of mindset, so to speak. So my product has to be the best product. So your focus is basically on making superior products and improving them over a period of time. तो मैंने अगर एक टाइप का से माउस ट्रैप बनाया और चूहे मारने का या चूहे को पकड़ने का एक यंत्र बनाया और इसको इम्प्रूव करने में मैं लगा हुआ हूँ, अगले साल मैंने लॉक सिस्टम को और अच्छा किया और पर्टिकुलर उसको डिजाइन को स्लीक बनाया एक्सेट्रा, बेटर माउस ट्रैप बनाने के चक्कर में मैं पूरा का पूरा फोकस मेरा है ऑन मेकिंग अ सुपीरियर प्रोडक्ट. ऐसा भी तो हो सकता है कि some competitor might look at what is the need that the product is satisfying to try to get rid of mice. So that particular company might come up with a spray, or it might come up with some kind of powder which might more effectively get rid of mice rather than a mouse trap. So basically, I might find myself completely redundant in the market because the market needs are being satisfied with some other product. So typically there were many Kodak cameras, etc. So people used to put a film inside a camera, and then they used to go on a vacation, and then once the film was over, then they used to buy it from another shop, and that film used to be put, and then that whatever film that they had already clicked photos they used to give for developing, and then they used to take a printout of that photograph, and then they used to put it in an album. This entire system of storing your memories has completely become redundant with the invention of digital cameras, with the invention of mobile phones. So obviously, if your focus is only to make a better camera using that same technology, and if the market need has been satisfied with some a new technology completely, then your obsession with making a superior product might lead to what has been described as marketing myopia. Myopia is a word that means short-sightedness. So it was a term that Theodore Levitt has coined. It refers to short-sightedness, wherein the marketer's entire energy is to sell the product and services, which is a superior product and services, without focusing on the customer needs and demands. So he loses focus of what the customer needs or wants, and he is trying to build a better mousetrap. So that syndrome has been captured here. Does building a better mousetrap actually work? It may work if there is no alternate product that is satisfying the market needs, in which case it might work. But what the customer is looking at is the satisfying the core need. So you are building a better sofa, but the customer is basically looking for a sofa that is a place to basically plonk himself in his house before he goes to bed, and he might be using that particular sofa for watching television. Now basically, if the television watching habits have changed, then he doesn't need a sofa. He basically sits on his bed and he basically watches Netflix. So basically the sofa might be a product that is a white elephant in his house, but you are a furniture company and you are trying to build a better sofa. Okay, possibly you might have to build some kind of furniture options that are going to be useful for a person for seating as well as for sleeping in his house, because it is miniature rooms and smaller rooms. So you might have to reorient your business focus. Rather than make a better sofa, you might have to think of modular furniture, or you might have to think about furniture that can fit in smaller rooms in modern urban spaces, and so on and so forth. So sometimes the focus of the organization or the focus of the owners in the organization is myopic. It is short-sighted. Okay, so that is what we call as the mousetrap syndrome. Right. So the product development team designs the product. So how does the product concept essentially operate? Your entire energies are focused towards designing a good product or the best possible product available. The finance department arrives at a price, and the marketing department has to then sell it. So marketing department बहुत फाइनल लास्ट में आता है, सब कुछ पहले से डिसाइडेड है कि ये भैया सबसे अच्छा प्रोडक्ट है, इसको बेचो. लेकिन this is typically what happened in America in the 1960s and 70s, where small Japanese cars came and captured the imagination of the baby boomers in the American market, teenagers who wanted to drive a car or people in their early 20s wanted to drive a car, but they did not want the petrol guzzlers that General Motors like Chevrolet etc. used to make, or Ford Motors used to make. So basically, the Japanese car makers like Toyota came up with a product that was satisfying the needs and wants of the young people in America, rather than focus all their interest in designing a great car which had great sleek looks, etc. So that's a classic example of how your excessive focus on product development or innovation might be sometimes myopic, or sometimes it might be misplaced, and the market might basically want something else which you are not really uh, putting your eye or putting your ear to the ground, right? Next, we have what is known as the the evolution selling concept. This is an approach towards marketing which basically holds that, or it believes that, if left alone, consumers will ordinarily not buy enough of the organization's products. So my entire focus is to indulge in aggressive selling, aggressive promotion effort. आपको एक के साथ दो फ्री मिलेगा, दो के साथ पांच फ्री मिलेगा, अगर आप आज खरीदते हैं तो आपको इतना ऑफ मिलेगा. So there's a lot of aggressive appealing to the customer to buy. So this is called as a push approach. You are trying to push the product onto the consumer. So if you look at this particular graphic here, this is basically the sales concept or the selling concept. So the focus, the starting point of the sales concept begins in the factory. So you basically have produced a car. So suppose there is a car available, so बहुत सारा inventory बना के रखा है, and you think that I should basically focus, these existing products should be sold using aggressive selling and promotion onto my customers, and therefore my entire efforts of the organization is to basically use a lot of effective sales staff. So the entire focus of the organization is on selling. तो मैं प्रोडक्ट बना के रखा है, सपोज मेरे गोडाउन के अंदर in 1997 when Maruti was phasing out the Zen car and it was coming up with a modified model known as ST-Low. There was a lot of inventory that was lying in the godowns of Maruti which they wanted to dispose of. So when somebody went to the market in 1997, sorry, in 2007, I'm so sorry, 1997 the Zen car was launched. So 2007 they were trying to phase out this particular model and it was being replaced by ST-Low. So in 2007, if somebody visited a Maruti showroom to buy, let's say, some other model of Maruti car, let's say the Alto model or the Maruti 800 model, so they would be aggressively uh, approached by the sales staff and they would be told that Zen car जो 3 lakh का है, हम लोग आपको 2.5 लाख में दे रहे हैं, why don't you buy this? So typically फैक्ट्री के अंदर ऑलरेडी प्रोडक्ट अवेलेबल है एंड उस प्रोडक्ट को आपको अच्छे अच्छे सेलिंग स्टाफ के द्वारा आपको पुश करना है. सो दिस इज द पुश अप्रोच, द सेलिंग कॉन्सेप्ट. सो योर एंटायर एफर्ट्स आर फोकस्ड ऑन pushing the product onto the customer. So the starting point of this approach is basically the product, right? And if you look at the marketing concept, in contrast, the marketing concept, the starting point is the market. That is, you try to find out the needs and wants of the market. So is the market desiring a small car? Is the market desiring a bike with good mileage and with good styling? And then I will design it accordingly based on the customer needs. Then I will use integrated marketing and then I will try to achieve profits. So the approach is, you start the process through understanding the market. But in sales concept, the starting point is the product which is already available and you push it onto the customer. So basically, bombard the customer with advertisements, bombard the customer with commercials, telemarketing, okay, and so on and so forth. Cold calling, credit card marketing typically is very, very common. So you have in various malls or in various supermarkets. The moment you try to enter Reliance Fresh or you enter a particular mall, you'll find a lot of people are standing just at the in the lobby and saying that, sir, do you want so and so company ka credit card? So they use a lot of, so unless they feel that unless selling happens, like life insurance is another product. So it is often said that life insurance is not bought, it has to be sold. Because essentially, what are you trying to sell? You're trying to sell the eventuality that if you die, what happens to your family? Nobody would like to conceive or imagine their own death. So basically, unless the salesperson pushes this particular concept onto you, you will, in a normal course of events, you will not think about this. So certain organizations, they uh, do adopt the selling concept, and the public identifies such kind of marketing with hard selling and advertising. So basically, the focus is on selling. कि product कुछ भी हो, I can sell snow to an Eskimo because I have a team of very good staff. But the problem with this approach is that many a times the product that you are trying to sell, if the customer doesn't need it only, then so you see it in certain kind of trains or buses. Somebody comes with, you know, ये 10 रुपए का पेन आप ले लीजिए, you know, उसके साथ एक और पेन फ्री, then उसके साथ एक और रबर फ्री, उसके साथ एक और something else free. So 5 items that he gives you for 10 rupees. Now you never plan to purchase it, but you think that okay, चलो गरीब आदमी का हम लोग खरीद लेते हैं. So घर जाके possibly none of the pens work for more than 2 days. So essentially you have been impressed by the hard selling of it. So, so this caption basically, or this graphic basically shows how much we are bombarded with brands and messages in our day-to-day lives. Okay, so therefore, in consumer behavior, you will study a particular concept known as how the consumer copes, how he tries to resist being bombarded with so much messages, and how he screens unnecessary information and he only stores certain information and so on and so forth. Right. So now if you look at sellers versus buyers market, we briefly discussed this earlier when we discussed the production concept, where the demand is higher than the supply. So if you recall the Model T of Henry Ford, in which the demand for that kind of car was very high, and therefore you want to keep your production costs low, so that for the assured demand that you already have, you would like to make maximum amount of money per item that you sell. So this is what a seller's market is. So as I said, in the 70s and 80s, early 80s in India, in the closed economy setup, Indian manufacturers were able to dominate the market, and they were able to do a lot of hoarding by releasing only that much product in the market from at periodic intervals, so that the customer could be charged a high price. Like for example, Bajaj scooters. So there was a huge demand for Bajaj scooters, but the consumers did not have any choice as far as other competitors were concerned. So what Bajaj chose to do is they chose to demand some money upfront, and if you give some extra money upfront, then your turn for getting a delivery of the scooter would come earlier than the other customer. So essentially, using that money, Bajaj was able to put it in the bank, and then later on they became a non-banking finance company. And today you have the insurance business in which Bajaj is available. So in fact, in a seller's market, the marketer dominates, and the hard work does not have to be done by the marketer to convince the buyer, because demand is anyway higher than supply. Okay, so everybody wants a good scooter. So if you curb the supply of scooters, people will still stand in line, and they will basically stand outside your factory to basically take delivery of the scooter. So in a seller's market, the seller dominates. In a buyer's market, however, post liberalization in India 1991-92, now there are many players. So Bajaj has to compete with Activa, they have to compete with other leading players like Piaggio, etc. So if you are manufacturing scooters, then Activa is also manufacturing scooter, Honda is also manufacturing scooter, TVS is also manufacturing scooter. So obviously now take any scooter as long as it is Bajaj's cannot be basically a message that the consumer is going to be going to tolerate. So the consumer will say, why should I purchase your scooter? That other scooter of Activa, the starting is so nice, the fuel efficiency is so nice, it has got a place to store my helmet also, it can also charge my mobile, etc. etc. It has got a its weight is also not so much, I can maneuver it very easily, and so on and so forth. It is coming in 5 colors, you are only offering it in 2 colors. So tell me why I should buy. So the buyer ask the marketer as to why I should buy. That means the marketing activity or the hard sell has to be done by the seller. The seller has to tell the buyer as to why he should buy from him. So a buyer's market is a market in which the supply is higher than the demand and the buyers dominate the market. Okay. So the bargaining power lies with the buyer in the buyer's market. The bargaining power lies with the seller in the seller's market. So as we have tried to indicate earlier, post Second World War in USA, it became a buyer's market. Whereas if you look at Henry Ford's 1920s, it was a seller's market. So post Second World War, there was a boom in the US market and lots of players. So in the refrigerator, there was Kelvinator, there was General Electric, there were many others. So if you look at this particular first caption, it's an ad of General Electric, it's an ad of Kelvinator. Both of these are using an army officer. So this is basically talking about post-war boom where American economy is doing very well and people want to live the American dream. It's also called as a baby boomer economy where lots of people, they want to basically ride the wave of growth in the American economy, which is as a result of having done very well because of having sold arms and ammunition to the rest of the world. In fact, the American economy, even till date, is highly dependent on its defense and its sales of aircrafts and sales of commercial and military aircraft and other weaponry. So marketing post Second World War required the marketer to now indulge in hard selling and telling the customer. So this is a typical print ad. These are all examples of print ads. All three of them are examples of print ad. So see how a lot of hard selling is being done. Customer is being convinced through a lot of text, through a lot of visuals, and trying to create certain want or demand for certain products because they know that they have purchasing power, right? Similarly, if you look at this particular caption, after total war, total living. So this again pointing towards post-war boom in America. So if you look at, on a lighter note, if you look at this, that these two are courting and this they are have gotten married and now they have a family. Okay. So all three pictures you see, hard sell is being done. And in fact, 1950s America was the America of, you know, huge economic growth. In fact, this huge economic growth also gave rise to a lot of uh, conspicuous consumption spending, buy today and pay later kind of syndrome. And a lot of people took loans, and the fact that they will be able to pay off their loans was a foregone conclusion. So that to hoga hi hoga. In fact, this attitude of buy today and pay tomorrow has resulted in what is known as a subprime crisis in America in 2007 2008, right? Where this attitude that the American economy can never collapse, okay, we will never go bankrupt. So this attitude was a result of a lot of hard selling and a lot of advertising and innovative commercials and trying to ride that wave of post-war boom. So this context is necessary to understand marketing concept. So basically, post-war America and the books that we basically today read, written in 1950s and 1960s by Kotler and others, they basically are from the point of view of buyer's market. So marketing books always are written in the from the point of view of buyer's market. That means the marketer will have to make the efforts to convince the buyer as to why he should buy. So the marketing concept is based on the principle that the key to achieving organizational goals is to determine the needs and wants of target markets. In fact, in the last class also we have focused on this, and deliver the desired satisfactions more effectively and efficiently than the competitors. Now, this key word, competitors, is becoming extremely important. So, lots of, there's a play known as Death of a Salesman by Arthur Miller. It describes this pre and post war America, and it describes the life of a salesman and how he was not able to cope with post war American life, because pre war he had assured customers and he used to just go to the customers, take the orders, and basically he would file the orders, and that is how he would get his salary or his commission. But post-war, there were so many competitors, and he was not able to really hold his job. And the entire play describes how his economic condition and his personal life deteriorated as a result of evolution of or change in the in the job front. It's a very interesting play and very famous play, Death of a Salesman. In fact, so coming taking the discussion forward, the marketing concept is basically something that rests on four important pillars. One is I try to understand the needs and wants of the customer, and through that, I understand the target market. I attempt to understand the target market and their needs and wants. I indulge in integrated marketing. That means all my efforts, whether it is demand estimation, whether it is product, whether it is place, whether it is promotion, whether it is pricing, all of that have to basically convey an sense of one thing. So integrated, all of them have to be coordinated together. And my entire aim of the entire activity is profitability. So essentially, target market, customer needs, coordinated marketing, and profitability are the main pillars on which the marketing concept is formed. So in our subsequent sessions, we will be elaborating on certain aspects of the discussion. So in some of the classes, we'll be talking about what are the various functions of marketing. In some of the class, we will talk about where, in terms of product, how do you analyze a product, etc., etc. So, but this happens to be the basis, or this happens to be the focus of the entire marketing textbooks that are written. One interesting term that we are hearing these days is known as societal marketing. Now, if you look at company profits, this is what even marketing concept talks about. Customer wants and satisfaction, this even marketing concept talks about. So as far as maintaining balance between company profits, consumer wants and satisfaction, and public interest, now this particular factor is a new factor in societal marketing. So it basically holds that companies should also be doing their business in such a manner that the interest of the public is always kept in mind. So I make a lot of profits by selling petroleum products, but if it is harming the environment and in the vicinity of the factory, people are dying of lung ailments, and many of my workers are dying because their lungs are affected by the pollution, then I am my sustainability over a long term is basically in question. So I must basically also be a responsible citizen. I must be a responsible community member. So in fact, lots of big organizations, according to the registered, if they are registered organizations, they have to spend certain parts of their profit, certain proportion of their profit in doing what is known as CSR, okay, corporate social responsibility. Now, one school of thought is that I am my allegiance or my loyalty is towards my shareholders. So whatever I should do, that is basically to make my company profitable and to maximize the value of my shareholders. And as long as I do it, it is okay. So to do that, I need to understand my consumers. So this part is understood. So this particular part is basically what my marketing concept says. So this human welfare को maximize करने के चक्कर में अगर मेरा profits अगर कम हो जाता है तो some people would argue that that is not my business. The business of doing welfare is the government's business. But then again, the government might give you land for free, like SEZs. Infosys has got 99-year lease at a very low cost. So is Infosys not responsible for maintaining the environment of that particular place good, or giving conditions to its workers, which or building roads in that particular area where its factory has been built, or maintaining certain things? So a lot of companies, they these days take up a lot of uh, society friendly activities, which is basically what societal marketing concept is talking about. So they take up societal activities in their operations and their surroundings, and in the annual report that they publish, there is also a chapter on, we have sponsored these many children for education, we have built these hospitals, or we have donated for this particular cause, or we have given sewing machines to so many people in the villages around the factory, and so on and so forth. So essentially, CSR is also a buzzword these days. In fact, in Europe, lots of companies, they are able to get more customers, especially countries like Germany and others, if they are perceived to be responsible citizens. So they might lose out if some adverse reports comes out and that they have polluted water bodies, or they have dumped certain chemicals into a lake, or because of an oil spill that has happened, a lot of whales have died. So these negative reports, they also affect them adversely. So most companies, they have a department in an organization known as the PR and the communications department, which tries to manage the perception that the public has about the company also. So therefore, that becomes an additional activity which falls under marketing. So therefore, the societal marketing concept is a concept that is even broader than the marketing concept, which also tries to include social responsibility into its fold. So these are some of the relevant issues regarding evolution of marketing over the years. Okay. So in our subsequent discussion, we will talk about things like what are the functions of marketing, and so on and so forth in our next session. Okay. So thank you for your attention. All the best.